Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, no, thank you, Jos. It's really kind of you to introduce me and invite me here to speak tonight. Like Jos said, we've been talking about this little adventure now for a couple of years, and I have to confess that I haven't been to the Netherlands that often in the past. I came and taught a little bit in Rotterdam in the early 90s, but I should also clear up one thing. My name is French. I have a French name, but I'm actually Indian. You know, I was born in Bombay. My father was half French, half Indian. My mother is Irish. So I don't speak anything but English, alas. So it's good of you to tolerate me coming here and speaking to you in English. But I have, I've emigrated to London when I was a child. And my father had died. He was an architect in India. We have a big connection with Britain. My father studied at the Bartlett. He was an architect. So we lived in London, and just to talk, I think a lot of my work and a lot of my interest, in academia and in practice, and just the opportunities that have come to me, are something to do with, I think, the situation we all experience in our lives now is something to do with the displacement, I would call it. We're not sure sometimes where we belong and how we respond to our context. And I always have this notion that, I'm Indian. There's a sort of notion of diaspora. In Britain, one is, I'm British, but I'm not English. These things, these kind of niceties matter, and I think here in Maastricht, where you are, you're close to Germany, you're close to Belgium, there's a lot of, what can I say, just the experience of just adjusting to the kind of situation, because it's different for everybody. And what I'd like to talk about tonight is this notion of collaborative practice. And I've been quite broad about this because I think in architecture we accept it as kind of normative that we collaborate. There's no escape from collaboration. Nobody can make architectural projects at any scale without collaboration. But I've done over, maybe the last 25, 30 years, I have crossed over and overlapped into art practice. And that's a different situation, where artists and architects have a different view to collaboration. I'll talk about that a bit more. But I wanted to start by showing you work that I did for a Japanese fashion designer, which is how I really started my career in architecture and practice in the early 80s. I worked for Michiko Koshino, and she comes from a fashion dynasty in Tokyo. She's got a sister, Hiroko, who had a house designed by Tadao Ando near Osaka at Ashiya. She got another sister also who is a fashion designer. Her mother is. So Michiko was the kind of the black sheep of the family. I don't know how you'd put it, but she came to London and got married to an Englishman and set up her office there. Did a lot of her fashion house in London. Did a lot of work around the club scene, and this was, it was an interesting commission for me. Literally, my first project was to make a shop for her flagship shop in Mayfair, just off Bond Street, in a kind of an English version of Art Nouveau. We designed an interior that for me has, little speculations about Baroque perspective. Most of this declared to Michiko, but this idea that the interior was a displaced space with a sort of shop front that you descended into. So my first project for Michiko was I think 1981, 82, you know, a kind of minimalist shop it was described as, where we had, you know, serious issues around listed buildings and what we could and couldn't do with the project. So there were little touches like store risers, which in Mayfair are great large pieces of upstand, and here was a kind of fairly lean acknowledgement of the name of the fashion house. But as a result of this project, we were invited by Michiko and her backers to make proposals for a series of shops in Tokyo and the Far East. And we responded by designing a kit of parts, a series of metal elements, which could be, you'll see these are pieces that are on casters, so there's a whole series of furniture elements and elements that makes, you know, enclosed space, and these could be dressed in different ways. So this model was made to send to Tokyo. This is made in brass and copper, and sent to Tokyo to the makers there, because they were rolling out, I think in Japan itself, 50 shops based on this idea. So this series of images are to do with this idea that the shop can be adaptable. It adapts to seasonal change. You know, the pieces themselves open and close, unfold, and we then also have to respond to the designer's own, you know, oeuvre. And Michiko had a very, she made a range of things, but she's most famous, I think, for designing inflatable clothes. And so when we looked at a dressing for one of her shops, this was with, you know, in terms of collaboration, you know, I was with Michiko and her husband, but also young designers whom she employed who had just graduated from Central St. Martin's. So this is Susie Brooke and myself. We evolved this idea of a kind of dressing for the elements within the shop. And I really enjoyed all of this work, but I also, in a slightly architectural hair shirt way, was critical of the fact that fashion was quite ephemeral. And, you know, we put a lot of time into these projects, and they'd last maybe a few months, maybe a couple of years if you're lucky, and then the shop is taken away and you do it again. So I kind of, in the end, got quite tired of this and decided to think about other things. But in the meantime, I also started evolving an interest, but partly out of invitation. And these are my collaborators in a project I did for the Venice Biennale in 1996. There's the curator on the left, her name is Vivian Lovell, and in the middle Heather Ackroyd, and on the right Daniel Harvey. And this, I'd never been to Venice till then. And we went there on a reconnaissance trip in April that year, and I had been asked to work with an artist of my choice. It was for the Architecture Biennale, and we were working outside the main British Pavilion on the Giudecca. And I invited Heather and Daniel to work with me because we had an interest in things that were kinetic, in things that were organic, things that grew, if you like. So they have an art practice that you will see how that impacted on the project. So in terms of kind of joint drawings, I mean, the one thing that's interesting is that Heather and Daniel never made drawings. We as architects were always drawing and sketching and testing at different scales. I mean, this was the one drawing we did. It's a jointly authored drawing, and we made a kind of scenario that we would work with the notion of the edicule. which was the sort of the idea of the little house as a kind of form in architecture, which Summerson writes about, and also it's a very important element in Indian Hindu temple architecture. But this idea of the kind of space within a space within a space was quite interesting for us. But we explored this through making various castings and various sort of explorations around the edicular idea. So this is a plaster piece, maybe about this big. We made several dozen of these, and then we placed them in the canals around Venice, and we left them there. We went back in July that year and worked through to September. So we placed these around the lagoon, and we let them stay there. And I suppose the work that the work I do, you could say that I'm kind of interested in a kind of literary approach. And I was very friendly with an artist, Helen Chadwick, whose work is there. I mean, Helen sadly died in the 90s when she was young, but she evolved a really interesting art practice around, she's feminist, but around the use of her body and the use of elements, very architectural, but a kind of mixed media scenario. And she kind of alerted me to Spenser's The Fairy Queen, which was this kind of long poem, I think a 16th, 17th century poem in English. But the piece that I'm putting up here, which talks about mutability, the idea that things change and decay. And it was an interesting time in art practice with Helen's work that she was interested in how things within the scale of, the scale time-wise of an art project, how change would be brought about. And it's something we maybe accept on one level in architecture, because architecture aims for a certain kind of period of time. But Spenser's text talks about this quite, I think, quite well. So this is what happened to some of the pieces that we put into the canal in Venice. There were various, depending on the kind of flow of water and the kind of trajectory and the position, these plaster pieces deformed and changed. And we placed them in a gallery space on armatures. The gallery was, I'll show you with this. It was on the Giudecca, which is this part of the. It's opposite the gallery was here, and you're right opposite St. Marco, which is there, and the Grand Canal is there. So we had a fantastic opportunity to work on the Giudecca, but we also worked on the Dorsoduro. So again, we were, of course, interested in Gothic Venice, but we were interested in Palladio, and the kind of use of the edicular on a kind of monumental classical scale. And we then serendipitously discovered, we were trying very hard to name the project. We surreptitiously discovered that altar bread, wafer, communion wafer, is not made in convents or monasteries anymore. It's a commercial operation. And this was just an article that I found in the Evening Standard about a factory, a bakery in southern England at Folkestone that made communion wafer. So this became a very interesting discovery. We call the project Host, and host has a variety of meanings in English. Host is the body to which parasites attach themselves. I mean, host is the communion wafer, and host has various connotations in terms of the way we relate to one another. We host things and so on. So we played games with the use of this communion wafer, and we made various dispensing machines in the city, chromium-plated little dispensing machines which were placed around the city for people to access communion wafer in a secular way. And then we played other games with the altar bread itself. These are 4 pieces of bread, each about the size of a roofing tile, a roofing slate, and so they come ready embossed. So you can have Christ on his cross, you know, upside down, the right way up, depending on how you chose to kind of deal with this. So we worked with the communion wafer panels and made a kind of an edicular structure held together with paper clips set above a tray of communion wine. And we were interested in void space and reflection. And so this piece was in the gallery, along with the plaster pieces. And we then also started another project in an old chapel on the Dosso Duro. And this is where Heather and Daniel's practice came into force. You know, they're interested in growing, you know, germinate. So we germinated grass seed on a structure, and then we watered it so that the structure started to flower. And it was placed in an old space, which was still a consecrated space. It was still used by a group of old people who lived in a house nearby. And we then built a little temple within an edicular space within that. But here the void was within the sort of volume of the grass upper part. And this is what happens to you if you come and work in my office. You know, you don't have to go down a coal mine. But the process of pigmenting the void was kind of interesting to deal with that. And this actually is Tom Emerson, Jos, yeah, who was working with me at the time. And this, it's very hard to photograph, so this has been like a collage of the piece in that space. And outside, all you get is this kind of impression of a kind of looming green mass. And we let this just rot in the end. During the course of the Biennale, for 2 months, we stopped watering it and we left it. So there's this notion of, you know, it was working for one period of time, and then afterwards I think we just couldn't attend to it, you know. And I think this is an issue we have in architecture, you know, how long do the works that we do keep our attention and retain our kind of our care and our love. And I think this kind of impacts on the kind of housing issues that we're facing these days, and always have done, you know, in the period of the late 19th century, 20th century, when we started making social housing. Jos has mentioned this book, Housey. I was invited to make a book with my wife, who's an anthropologist, and we had this idea that we would make a pattern book, a book in the tradition of, you know, the great pattern books, and also the pattern books of just everyday ornamentation and so on that you had in the 18th, 19th century, Batty Langley and people like that. So Housey took 23 of our projects, which we categorized in terms of location, material, and, you know, other kind of adjectives, and we somehow were able to kind of classify them playfully. So this is a page or a series of stills out of Housey when we were putting that together. We then exhibited at the RIBA that to celebrate the launch of the book. An academic and photographer, David Grandorge, and his students at the Cass School of Architecture, his students made dolls' houses which were taken from the projects in the book. So we gave them a table and we gave them a set of drawings of the houses, and then they had to reinvent it. And there was this idea that, you know, the pattern book is a gift where you can interpret from it. It's not about faithful copying. So Housey was some kind of, you know, celebration of that notion of invention. This was a project that we built in 6 houses back to back, and this indicates how that works. Then we also had this project. This is called the Invisible House, and the Invisible House is an underground house. So this table was adapted to illustrate some of the tenets of that project. And then the Invisible House itself exists, you know, in this photograph as a before and after. This is in West London. This is one of my key interests, I think, academically, is interwar British suburbia. It's kind of where the majority of the British live. You know, most of us live in the suburbs, and we are desperate to abandon the suburb and go to the city. The suburb is always termed as in a pejorative sense. So we evolved a project to do with a house that was partially buried in the ground. Very traditionally, it relates to a courtyard house in most cultures. And what was interesting for me here in West London, that it was an attempt to understand and enjoy semi-detached suburbia, which is undergoing kind of death by 1,000 cuts. You know, these houses are not respected. The existing houses are changed, altered, windows replaced, dormer roofs added, garages, etc. The front gardens are crossed over with make space for your car parking and so on. So the idea here was to say, well, let's make another order of, another typology, another letter in the alphabet of types. And this was called the Invisible House, which sits in the back garden of an existing semi-detached house, and it deals with all the sort of protocols, the regulations about overlooking, rights of light, daylight, sunlight, good quality construction, and it provides a range of loose fit spaces. And it's a kind of another kind of idea of displacement, and I'll come to the issue of collaboration in a bit, but here we've basically taken out the garden and put the garden back on the roof, so that when you see it from the road, the darker piece is below ground, the lighter piece is above ground. You drive in, park on the roof of the bedroom, that you drive in and park, that's the car park there. This is the void space over the sunken courtyard, and then the rest of it is a barbecue, a lawn, a greenhouse. You go through the greenhouse down into the ground floor, which is this space, and in this instance shown as an armature, which is a kitchen, a bath, a stove, a fireplace, living room, bedroom, and then a service zone which contains bathroom, storage, even a small desk. And then above your head, this idea of registering the sky and relating the building, you know, in a way, you know, in a grand gesture, you know, cosmically to the heavens. The grid is this kind of the artifice of registering that moment, you know, above your head, the heavens. And this was an idea of the Invisible House, you know, densification of suburbia by stealth, I would call it. where these houses could be built by anybody in their back garden, and then suddenly you have, you know, double the density of suburbia, and it responds to the needs for different kinds of demographics now. This area is very much, you know, populated by a Greek community who live in a very different way to the English, but you know, hopefully you could respond to that, but it was for anybody really, and the idea was that you could double the density without necessarily expressing that in a visual sense. You know, I like the modesty of the garden wall, the garden fence, and it could be used in different ways. It could be used as an adjunct to an existing house. It could be used as a separate flat, or a separate apartment, separate house, or it could be used for a live workspace. So it had all of these possibilities. And when we proposed building this is the technique, the technology of sheet steel piling. This is not the site. This is a construction site in Greenwich by Hawksmoor's great church, St. Alphege. But we use sheet steel piling, and we worked with Max Fordham's very good engineer in Britain. We worked with Max himself, and Dewhurst McFarlane, very good engineer. So the collaboration about how to make this and how to sort of make it as a sort of piece of construction, you know, that was habitable, was a very kind of particular kind of endeavor for me, working with them. You know, the coffers of the piling became an opportunity to make storage space and so on. But you can see that the same layout pretty much existed. The one thing that we did with this part of the project was to elevate the roof, because the planning authorities refused us permission to just lift the roof ever so slightly, because there were issues they felt of overlooking. We thought those were issues of conviviality and connection with neighbors, but we were disallowed from that. So the roof is elevated, but what this does do is that this is the bedroom with the parking space, a section through the double height living room now, and another view through that. So what it does do is it does allow this space, this house, to become much more flexible in terms of how you make it and adapt it. So this could be one house for a couple or some single person or live work, but it could also be subdivided into several different bedrooms so that you could live there as a family. And in London, we have kind of existence minimum, I would say. Our space standards are quite reductive. So, and what you see here in these, in the coffers, they're glazed, they're treated like vertical cold frames that you'd find in a garden. And the courtyard, and then the double height space, which has the potential for subdivision into more bedrooms. So this has been a very kind of influential project for me, and we were able to evolve this project and test it out in various other scenarios. I'm not really going to show you any of that tonight, but on the basis of that project, we won a competition for the House of the Future, which we built prototypes at the Ideal Home Show at the turn of the century. But this house, I want to talk about in terms of hybridity. We conceive this house as a timber box on a brick plinth, but it was done with a developer who, for reasons of economy and reasons of speed, we made it as a timber frame. So we dressed it in timber. We had a brick plinth, but in fact it's a steel structured building. And this is a family house which has a kind of inversion. We have cinema room on the basement, ground floor is parking, entrance, bedrooms on the first floor, living room and garden room on the upper floors with the garden there. And it's connected to an existing hotel built on the banks of the River Thames, tested through model and silhouette, and again in reference to this notion of hybridity. I felt construction, you know, we're all constrained by the economics, time frame, but just generally what's available. And I think this idea of hybridity is quite useful to take on board. And this is a piece by Richard Wilson, the artist, where he marries a caravan with a garden shed. I like this image as a kind of, a kind of playful exemplar of this notion of that. And then you can make nice spaces. So this is a view from the upstairs living room of the river. This is where the Oxford and Cambridge boat race ends. So you get a kind of a fleeting view of that. It's quite modest and careful in how it's detailed, but that was not the point of this, the project. It was really just wanting to show you how these projects come about. And similarly with this project, which started life, you know, as a 60s detached house in Greenwich, built for two artists, John Christopherson and his wife Anne. We were approached by our client, and they happened to be a young couple who were having twin sons. And in fact, one is a fashion designer, one is a graphic designer. Ben designed our book for us. But the brief here was to make a bigger house for them, and we were able to add another story here. And we couldn't salvage any of this timber, so we found the brick, still made, a beautiful handmade brick, and we infilled the various spandrels. Ben designed, the collaboration was with the client, a designer. He designed the various patterns for the brickwork, and we just elevated it by one story. And we turned it from a kind of slightly lopsided house into something more cubic. And then became quite playful in terms of how we started dressing all the openings here. Christopherson's work included this rather beautiful collage, which we couldn't retain, unfortunately. So this was documented, and then part of this was demolished. And the house is in Greenwich this is Greenwich Park. Here's the Thames. It's just here, and if you see it from the park, it sits up above the trees. It's in a territory of domestic residential work, and what's interesting is that it's on the scarp slope of the chalk before you come to the clay London plain, the floodplain of the river. And what the land does there is come down it's been terraced, and this is one of John Christopherson's paintings. So we inherited a sort of stepped landscape, but I'll quickly show you the interior of the house, playing a game with the sort of herringbone pattern, the parquet floor in maple. We used a palette, very reduced palette, paint, parquet, and Carrara marble, and the external joinery in utility, which we borrowed from a neighbor's property, a lovely 1960s listed house, and we were able to kind of make some very, within this tight cube, we were able to make some quite interesting fluid spaces, which were about catching the light, catching the view, etc. And acknowledging and enjoying the difference in texture. There were times when we were going to sort of, mute the brickwork, which was fresh, on the north face of the building, but we enjoy the fact that brickwork, the new brickwork with the old sort of rather mossy brickwork has this contrast, became quite an interesting leitmotif for the house. So here's the house facing the river. We gave it a grand double height opening to acknowledge that. And what you see at the bottom left of the photograph is the 1960s house called Meridian West, which is a listed house now. And we stole, borrowed, had a conversation with that house. We took the details for the utility, windows, sliding doors, pivot doors from there. And our current project for this house is we're now, the existing house is here. We're now building a version of the invisible house here because of the way the slope works. You'll see in this image, this is Meridian West, this is the existing house, and then this is a version of the invisible house. So this idea that themes within the work come back. This is a different version, but it nonetheless influenced by some of that earlier work we were doing. And at the same time as that project was happening, we were doing a project for a developer on a building that he'd already converted from a gas laboratory. Here we were adding 2 pavilions on the roof of this building. This is in Fulham in London. And for us, it was again a kind of a project of before and after. We were just taking the redundant plant rooms and we were just sleeving them and transforming them from utilitarian space into domestic space. The collaborative endeavor here was really with a brilliant engineer called Aaron Chadwick, who runs a practice called Atelier One. Now, Aaron engineered these with us, and these were prefabricated buildings done with a purpose. We were able to then build these in a factory to quite exacting standards in Manchester and bring them to the site in Fulham. All this property below was occupied, therefore we were able to add these units, add the houses, and the heavy work of that was done in about 3 weeks instead of 6 months. So that was a kind of interesting initiative, because there were lots of very difficult neighbors who were obviously concerned with their noise and so on. So we were able to kind of alleviate some of their concerns. What we did here was just wrap the building in a gauze. Again, a kind of hybridity where the appearance is this sort of shimmering metal, but in fact it's a whole series of elements and components quite rudely put together. And we were interested here in this kind of idea of a blurred silhouette, so that when you look at the top of the building, there's a kind of a blurring, and this view demonstrates the view facing the city. So these houses were like little classical temples on the rooftop of the existing building. And now we are adding another element to this ensemble, where these are the 2 rooftop houses here and here, and this building that you see at the bottom with the tower, this is called the Rocket Room. We're now making a project for what they call B1. So the plinth, the angular plinth, is office, and the tower is residential. The ground floor offers a kind of porte cochere to these kind of angular office spaces and access to the flats above. This is the ground floor with some parking. You can see the the access to the lift on the left-hand side of the plan. That's the lobby to go up, a fire escape stair. And then each flat is this flat in the round. It's a faceted plan, 32-sided plan shape. It provides, it's not vast, it's about 1,800 square feet, 180 square meters, 3 bedrooms. But the game here is to not really touch the perimeter wall so that your doors slide back into the body of the building to kind of offer this kind of promenade. We were talking about architectural promenade just now, but this is another kind of promenade here. And it was an interesting project for me because the developer Crispin Kelly studied architecture at the AA with Peter Salter, and is a kind of special kind of developer. You know, he acts in the form of a patron, and really the conversation of this project emerged out of a lot of discussions with him about, you know, architecture. So these are the flat plans. They're kind of all the same, but all different. And then the view from the apartment over the kind of the hinterland of the Thames, but not in Greenwich this time, but in West London. And to kind of finish this little section of the project, of the lecture, I've shown you sort of houses, you know, in timber, brick, steel. I mean, this is an opportunity that I had to make a project in Umbria, near Todi, just in the Umbrian Mountains, just off the Tiber Valley. The site is sort of over here. You'll have, and it's hidden in this cluster of trees. The crane is because the photograph was taken when the project under construction. This is part of the Faina estate. The Faina are kind of ancient family who have an estate that runs for several thousand hectares. But our client, for whom I'd worked in London, bought part of it, including a castle, a ruined castle on the mound, and a chapel, which has been much altered. You know, some of it is 14th century, some of it 19th century. It was deconsecrated in the 1980s and lived in by a German family who used it as a summer house. So we, a lot of our effort, this project was on site for about 5 years, and a member of the office lived on site for 2 years. The project was very much about this restoration of the fabric of the existing building, which consisted of a chapel and a priest's house and a cobbler's house, and a little village called Montione, and this is all that's left. So the chapel is here. This is kind of restored and treated like a vestibule, a kind of quasi-living room. The plan shows you on the left is the ground floor, so the chapel is there, and it's the domestic accommodation is like an L shape wrapped around it, and we worked with what was there. We restored it, we repaired it, turned it into a sort of slightly grand family summer house with 5 bedrooms. And then we added, in the lower part of the building, we added a pool room and a pool, and a studio flat here, so that, and tested it. I mean, I thought this is quite nice to show you. A really brilliant young architect, Mo Wong, working with me, and she made this rather beautiful paper model of the project just to sell it to ourselves, but also to communicate to the client the qualities of the project. At the time, we were thinking to cantilever the pool, and we changed that. We thought that the gesture was too much, but it also was going to be very difficult to build, and it was an issue to do with sight lines when you start to set these kind of buildings out. The client was very, very interested in this project, and they were both aesthetes, and they both wanted to be there a lot of the time when we were doing this. So a lot of it was about a collaboration with them, and I think all the better for it for me. And we then also tested it at a very large scale. This is a model perhaps as big as this table, of part of the pool room, the pool terrace and the pool at an exhibition at the Academy in Copenhagen. And we then started building, and the building process went on and on and on, because Umbrian winters are very harsh, Umbrian summers are very hot, and the builder can't work in either part of that. So the building time became quite limited, but perhaps useful to the architect to be able to kind of have more consideration about the project. And this kind of is perhaps my favorite photograph. This is like the promise of the building, but this is the terrace above the pool and the pool room. And here you just peep over the side, you see the pool and the terrace. And we were trying to work very sensitively with elements that we found in the landscape, like this wall on the right, which is a kind of part of a rampart, and then the chapel terrace wall in stone. So the conversation between the sort of material became very interesting for us. And we'd never done any, we've done little pieces of concrete, but nowhere in England there's no tradition anymore to make any concrete work. So there was nothing to refer to. But it became I feel a kind of a way of a piece of rustication supporting the kind of the old part, you know, and deferring to it, and then we had the opportunity to play games almost too precious with the board marking and other elements, but you can see what this was all about. It's all about this fantastic view, the view sort of to the northeast over the Tiber Valley. Not perfect. It's not like Tuscany. This is quite a conflicted landscape full of industry in the valley, but nonetheless it has, you know, real beautiful qualities. And then this is a view of the project which demonstrates this, you know, the subordination of our insertion with the rest of the building. And I'd like to end with a just very different scale of project. These are unbuilt projects, but these are projects which are for me a new kind of collaboration with Busan Opera House, with competition for the opera house in Korea. Busan is the second city after Seoul. We called our project Opera on the Move, and I collaborated with Yezi Kuo. He's a Chinese architect who had worked with me in London and in Italy, and then he went to live in Beijing, and he lived in Beijing. There was another student of mine from the AA, Ben Bella, and I was in London orchestrating the engineers and the cost consultants, and we made a proposal which was quite kind of, on one level, quite playful, but I thought really interesting for the Koreans, you know, who don't have a reputation for, you know, the dissemination of Western opera, you know, classical opera. So this idea that part of the building could appear in different countries around the world. You know, you could sail the opera house to New York, but most of the time, or some of the time, the building was an integral part of an ensemble of performance spaces on the harbor side at Busan. And you can see the kind of diagram here showing how it detaches itself from the harbor wall. And we liked this idea because we thought our project was offering the client body, not 3 performance spaces, but we gave them multiple performance spaces, including these kind of interstitial spaces. Once the mobile part of it, the floating part, detached, there's one space, and then there is one space also there. So the idea of this kind of building having a versatility was quite intriguing for us. We tested it. This was our kind of homage to Malevich and his Architecton, but at the scale of a battleship, an aircraft carrier, and then engineered in a way the collaboration also with, again, Aaron Chadwick. There were no columns in this building. It was all plate, stress skin construction. We thought this is more appropriate to the idea of a building that sat beside the harbor that was almost masquerading as a ship. So it allowed us to kind of create a kind of an ensemble of performance space and then sandbagged on sides by all the other different elements that were required in the program. And another, so we didn't come anywhere near to winning that one, but we nearly won this one. And this is a project led by a developer called Urban Splash in Somerset on the Bristol Channel. So this is England and that's Wales, and this is the Bristol Channel. We were asked to make a project on this site. This is Birnbeck Pierre. This was a listed building, a listed structure built in the 19th century, but abandoned in the 1930s. And we were asked by Urban Splash, there was no program, just make the most eye-catching project you can think about. And my wife's family come from Weston-super-Mare, so I know it quite well. And we were quite interested in the kind of British seaside experience, which is full of, it's quite vulgar, it's quite coarse on some levels, but it's full of vitality. So we proposed a very big building in the shape of a very small island, and I think you'll get the picture now. This is the view from Sand Bay, which is to the south, and this is like a building that has detached itself from the headland and is a kind of natural piece. But the game here was about the artifice of a building. We're not trying to make this look like a natural built piece of outcrop when you get close to it. So here you understand the kind of the scale of it. This is 20 stories high, and it's covered in this carapace, which is packed with earth, and you can grow the flora that you can on the headland. Our engineers, I did this in collaboration with Jonathan Vining at a practice in Cardiff where I was professor for a while, visiting professor, and John and I made this project, and we used the resources of quite a big company there to kind of generate the background to this project. And it's thought through in a lot of detail. There is a sort of subterranean passage that you can drive and service the building. A lot of wind turbines at this lower level. There's a what we call a horizon deck, that the people arrive, the public arrive from the mainland onto the deck. It has various kind of, it's a bit like an airport, possibly will end up like an airport, that, you know, full of concessions, but the opportunity to invest it and infuse it with a lot of life. And then as you go up through the building, the south side and the west side are vertical, and that's where you put 200 apartments and a hotel. The north side, which kind of slopes, Bill, gosh, I can't remember his surname now, but our engineer, Bill Watts, he suggested, and this became a kind of an idea that we could use and build lots of these off the coast of Britain, maybe Holland, a place for data centers which are secure, generate a lot of energy so that the minimal output, energy output for this building, but then within the data center, which is black box, we inserted a whole series of elements, the program of the seaside, you know, so a music hall, cafe, casino, cinema, etc. And then when you come to the very top of the building, but you're not actually on top of the building, then there is a kind of an interior landscape, which is where the hotel guests can have access to. So the section works like this: residential on the right, the black box data center and elements from the seaside, you know, theater, casino, etc. And then this kind of landscape, an interior landscape below the carapace. The horizon deck. And wanting to just to tell you the way that we conceived the carapace. This is a kind of concrete structure where we didn't want to, we chose to work with a kind of Islamic pattern for this, which talks about the microcosmic and the macrocosmic. And the Islamic pattern was adapted so that it could wrap across the whole structure, and apertures in that were tested through a model which gave it a kind of more irregular appearance. There's no, you know, it's disorderly, but there's a kind of an underlying order to this. And then the convention of the kind of bourgeois apartment was played out. All the apartments were duplex with 3 bedrooms and you know, double height living room, set behind this carapace, which is what you see here on here, and then what you have is this sort of relationship, a kind of a veiling between the domestic environment through this sort of grand piece looking at the town beyond. And from what they call west, I think this is Sand Bay. This is a nature reserve. So the idea here from this side, it starts to pick up more of the kind of natural elements. And we made a kind of relationship to these existing islands in the channel. This one, there's another one, and one is called Steep Home, one is called Flat Home, and we title this Pleasure Home. And unfortunately, I think this was a 2-stage competition. I think my experience of entering competitions where there are 2 stages and I'm shortlisted, and we don't often win in the 2nd stage, is I think the judges make their mind up at stage 1. And I don't know why they ask the rest of the people to make any effort at stage 2. But they actually told us that 11 of the 12 judges liked this best at stage 1. At stage 2, what they told us was that, oh, your project is really quite big, Pierre. You know, this is like a million square feet of development. You know, that will probably cost over 200 million pounds, you know, but our budget is only 18 million. So we, you know, why didn't they tell us this at stage one, yeah? Or even at the beginning of the competition. It's a kind of crazy business. So much effort, you know, I can't begin to tell you, you know, not tens of thousands, but kind of hundreds of £1,000s worth of fees when you have all your consultants around you. And none of it paid for. I think the honorarium was £3,500. So, but we still do them because we like testing, you know, and it is enjoyable to kind of, you know, play with ideas at this kind of scale, which is something I don't often have a chance to do in my practice, which is, as you see, mostly much smaller, more carefully nurtured projects. So yeah, this is a parting shot of Birnbeck Island, and I wanted just to finish now with this project called Apparition, and it's the three bombs that you see on the poster. And this project came about from a very, you know, a very ordinary commission. I was asked to convert this house. The neighbors had a garden here, and we, in looking at the plans of the Ordnance Survey, the house is here, and the red block is where we had a side garden to add something. The client wanted a side extension. But when we look back in terms of researching the history of this site, the site looked like this. And what we discovered was that this site, it's kind of exceptional in West London. West London wasn't as badly bombed in the war as the East, because East was where most of the industry was. But the West also took some big hits, and so what you ended up with was this instead. So we were able to get permission for this kind of mirror image project for the site. So I kind of call this Apparition, and during this time I was invited to by a group of artists and architects. I mean, 4 architects, most of us connected in some way to the AA. Artists from a group mostly around Camberwell Art School. And we were given a church in East London, in South East London to work in, a place called Dilston Grove. But I evolved the theme of the bomb site. And here you have the view of St. Paul's not long after the area around it had been bombed. The view from the cupola at St. Paul's after a bombing raid. And what you had, I think, in East London and the Docklands was this sort of things that happened, no doubt, here and places like Rotterdam, you know, total destruction. So this map indicates the Surrey docks, and you can see the black is total destruction. And when you see the key at the bottom, it's different colors relate to the kind of extent of damage. But our site was just here. So yeah, where is our site? Yeah, our site was just there. There's an amazing church, a concrete church, the first concrete structure in London, a first ecclesiastical concrete structure in London, which is now a gallery. So we were in there. So it's kind of in position just there. And so we did some research, and we have the Imperial War Museum in London. I found a few examples, or maybe 2 examples of the SC-50. But these 3 bombs were the most frequently used bombs by the Luftwaffe I think they dropped 30,000 on London in that short period during the Battle of Britain. So we thought, rather, you never see the bomb itself. You always see the kind of the destruction wrought by the bomb, and you never even see fragments. So the project evolved into me making my own little drawings of each bomb, and then we started making these, and the collaboration here was with my ex-brother-in-law, who's a famous product designer, who did a lot of the work on Star Wars for the stormtroopers and all of that stuff. So he, in effect, I acted as an assistant to him, and he started making these bombs for us. And it's an interesting process for me as a kind of the architect. We never really get our hands too dirty, yeah. So this was interesting, and so these are like, and we very rarely build one-to-one. So this is one-to-one scale. These are full size, and you can see the scale of them in relation to the mannequin. The S50 is about this big, and the 250 here, and the 500 is about 2.4 meters high. Very big pieces. Very interesting for us to work on this. And yeah, just a few images. This is the church at Dilston Grove. We did some really very nice studies on proportion here. The golden mean, the golden section is inherent in this structure. If you know a little bit about English artists, Richard Wentworth lived in this church when he was a student at the RCA, and had some very interesting stories to tell. For instance, during one of the bombing raids, it's his very next door to a little row of terraced houses. A couple were in bed. The bomb went off. The bomb blew. The windows blew out. This man had his suit on a dresser by the window. Everything was sort of sucked out of the window, and you have to know Richard. He tells it well, better than me, but he said the roof of the church lifted up, and in that moment the waistcoat of the man's suit landed on the wall of the roof, of the wall, and then the roof came down. And his wife told this story, so the waistcoat is probably still up there somewhere, but incredible. But so this church has some interesting anecdotal history, but it's also a historically important building. And again, just the scale. When you see the bombs, you'll realize that these are figures in the space, and then the installation within that space, and the pieces that I made were at the back, or Andrew made. I helped, yeah. But we call this the Holy Family apparition, and we modified the pieces to kind of anthropomorphize them as well. So Mary has 2 breasts, Joseph has a willy, and Jesus is sexless at the moment. But this project is one that I'm evolving into another kind of scenario now, where we're hoping that the Soane Museum will, because the Soane Museum was badly bombed in the war, and the Dulwich Picture Gallery, we want to make a kind of narrative within that space around Soane's pieces, around this project. So that's it. Yeah, thank you very much.